The rain hammered against the diner's windows, each drop adding to the rhythmic thrum of the storm outside. Emily's hands moved mechanically, wiping down the counter as the flickering neon sign outside cast streaks of light on the damp floor. A small group of customers lingered, their tired faces mirroring her own exhaustion. Yet, beneath her weariness, a quiet determination kept her moving. One more hour, one more table, one more shift to survive. The peace was broken by a loud voice from the corner booth. "I said medium rare, not burnt." The man's voice carried across the diner, drawing glances from the few patrons. Emily forced a polite smile as she approached the table, her notepad clutched tightly in her hand. "I'm sorry about that, sir. Let me fix it for you," she said, her voice calm despite the frustration bubbling inside. She took the plate back to the kitchen, the sting of his words lingering. Her co-workers exchanged sympathetic glances, but said nothing. Emily brushed it off and returned moments later with a fresh plate, her smile unwavering. "Here you go, sir. I hope this is better," she said, her voice steady. He grunted, barely looking up, and waved her off. The emotional weight of her day pressed down, but Emily held her composure, determined to get through the night. The bell above the diner's door chimed softly, a sound nearly swallowed by the storm. Emily glanced up and saw an elderly man step inside, his clothes soaked and his shoulders hunched against the cold. Water pooled beneath his shoes as he hesitated at the door, scanning the room with tired eyes. Emily's gaze followed him as he shuffled toward a corner table, his movements slow and deliberate. Something about him seemed out of place, his worn coat and weathered face a stark contrast to the warmth of the diner. Emily approached cautiously, her notepad in hand. "Good evening, sir. Can I get you something warm to drink?" she asked, her tone soft and welcoming. The man hesitated before nodding slightly. "Just a coffee, please," he said, his voice barely audible. Emily nodded and returned moments later with a steaming mug, setting it gently in front of him. He looked up at her, surprise flickering across his face, and managed a faint smile. "Thank you," he murmured. Emily nodded, her own smile small but genuine. She returned to her duties, her thoughts lingering on the man and the quiet sadness in his eyes. As the night wore on and the diner emptied, Emily prepared to close up. The storm had lessened, but the rain still fell steadily. She stepped outside to lock the door and saw the elderly man in the parking lot, crouched beside his car with a flat tire. Her heart sank at the sight of him struggling in the rain, his hands fumbling with a jack that refused to cooperate. Without hesitation, Emily grabbed her coat and rushed to the side. "Let me help you," she said, her voice cutting through the sound of the rain. The man looked up, startled, but said nothing as she knelt beside him. Realizing the jack was broken, Emily made a quick decision. She pulled out her phone and called a repair service, explaining the situation. "Don't worry, they'll be here soon," she reassured him, offering a small smile as they stood together beneath the drizzle. The man's gratitude was evident in his eyes, though his words remained few. When the repairman arrived, Emily quietly handed over her own cash to cover the cost. The man's protests were gentle but firm, and she waved them off. "It's okay," she said simply. "Everyone needs a little help sometimes." Once the tire was fixed, the man stood by his car, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out to shake hers. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, his voice filled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Emily shrugged, her smile kind. "I'm glad I could help. Drive safe, okay?" The man nodded and climbed into his car, but not before giving her a long, searching look. "Thank you," he said again, the words carrying more weight this time. Emily watched as he drove away, the taillights disappearing into the rain-soaked night. As she returned to the diner, Emily felt a quiet sense of fulfillment, though curiosity lingered. Who was this man? What had brought him here on such a stormy night? The question swirled in her mind as she locked the door and headed home, the memory of his gratitude warming her heart against the chill of the rain. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as Emily tied her apron around her waist. Her body ached from the double shift she had been pulling for months now, yet her focus remained sharp. The smell of fresh coffee and grilled sandwiches filled the air, a constant reminder of her endless hustle. Outside, the faint hum of traffic blended with the occasional ring of the cash register inside. Emily carried plates deftly to a family of 4, her smile unwavering even as her mind drifted to home. Her mother was likely resting on the worn-out couch, her frail health a constant source of worry. Across the small apartment, her younger brother would be hunched over his school books, oblivious to the sacrifices Emily made to keep his dreams alive. She clung to one thought: if she kept pushing, if she worked just a little harder, maybe, just maybe, they could have a better life. Her smile faltered slightly as she cleared the dishes from a corner table, a fragment of a hurtful remark ringing in her ears. Earlier that week, a neighbor had sneered, still waitressing. "I thought you'd aim higher." She laughed it off, but the sting lingered. It wasn't the first time her job had drawn judgmental glances or thoughtless comments. Emily brushed the memory aside, her determination outweighing the bruises to her pride. The next table had left a small tip, and she pocketed it with a sigh. Every dollar counted: the rising medical bills for her mother, the rent overdue by 2 weeks, and her brother's school fees loomed over her like dark clouds. She had learned to live without extras. Every decision now was about survival. Food or the electric bill? Groceries or bus pass? Each choice cut deeper into her dwindling reserves. Even in these struggles, Emily found ways to extend kindness. On her lunch break, she slipped a few dollars into the hand of a coworker who looked particularly downcast. At the end of her shift, she packaged the untouched bread rolls and handed them to the homeless man she passed daily on her walk home. "Here, have something warm," she said, her voice soft yet genuine. Rain began to fall lightly, speckling the diner's windows. The sound was oddly soothing, a contrast to the weight Emily carried. As she refilled coffee cups and checked on patrons, the door chimed, and a gust of cold air entered with an elderly man. His clothes were worn and wet, his face lined with stories untold. He hesitated near the entrance, his eyes scanning the room before settling on an empty booth. Emily approached him, notepad in hand, her voice gentle. "What can I get you, sir?" He looked up, his gaze weary yet kind. "Just a coffee, thank you," he murmured. She returned moments later with a steaming mug, placing it in front of him with a smile. His fingers wrapped around the cup, soaking in the warmth as he nodded his thanks. Something about his presence lingered with Emily, a quiet mystery she couldn't place. The rain intensified as the night wore on. Emily finished wiping the counters and flipped the sign to close before stepping out into the wet evening. She paused in the parking lot, her eyes catching the elderly man struggling by his car. He knelt by the rear tire, the flat rubber sagging under the weight of the vehicle. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the jack. Emily hesitated only a moment before moving to the side. "Need some help?" she asked. He looked up, startled but relieved, and nodded. Together, they attempted to fix the tire, but the jack was bent and useless. Without a second thought, Emily pulled out her phone and called the repair service. "Don't worry," she assured him, her tone steady. "They'll be here soon." When the repairman arrived, Emily quietly paid for the service, waving off the man's objections. "You've had a rough night," she said simply. "Consider it a favor." The elderly man shook her hand firmly, his gratitude evident in his expression. "You're too kind," he said softly. Emily smiled, her heart lighter despite the rain soaking through her coat. As his car pulled away into the dark, Emily stood under the dim parking lot light, the rain falling in steady rhythms. She didn't know who he was or why he had chosen this diner on this night, but something told her this meeting wasn't ordinary. She locked up the diner and headed home, the memory of his worn face and heartfelt thanks warming her against the cold night ahead. The stack of bills on the counter seemed to grow taller every week. Emily sat at the kitchen table, the light above flickering faintly as she flipped through the notices. Each one was a stark reminder of what she owed: the hospital bill for her mother's latest treatment, the overdue rent notice from her landlord, the tuition payment for her younger brother's schooling. Her chest tightened as she calculated the numbers again and again, hoping they might somehow shrink. They never did. The sacrifices she made had become a daily rhythm. Her own dreams had faded into the background as she prioritized her family's needs. New shoes for her brother, school supplies, medication for her mother, all while she made do with the bare minimum. Her clothes, worn from years of use, and the skipped meals were minor prices to pay in her eyes. Yet the weight of it all lingered, pressing down on her as she sat there in the quiet of the night. At the diner, Emily faced another challenge, the judgment of others. She could feel the stares from certain customers, their disapproving glances as if her apron and tired smile defined her worth. "You're still working here?" one woman had asked weeks earlier, her tone laced with condescension. "Shouldn't you be moving on by now?" Emily had smiled politely, swallowing the sting of the comment. Flashbacks of similar encounters came to mind as she served tables. A group of young professionals laughing too loudly, ignoring her presence, leaving behind crumbs and a measly tip. The neighbor who had whispered, "She's nice, but it's sad she's stuck there." Each remark chipped away at her confidence, but Emily's resilience held firm. She reminded herself why she endured this, her family. Still, the quiet moments alone brought a different battle. Emily often found herself questioning if her efforts mattered. Late at night, when the world seemed to pause, she'd sit on the edge of her bed, her hands gripping her knees. "Does it make any difference?" she'd whisper into the silence. The weight of doubt was heavy, yet she clung to the hope that her kindness and perseverance would lead somewhere meaningful. She longed to believe her sacrifices had purpose. Her thoughts often drifted to the stranger she had met that rainy evening. There was something about him that lingered in her mind, his hesitation, his gratitude. The worn edges of the business card he had left behind caught her eye on the counter. She picked it up and studied it again. The name was smudged, the address incomplete, as if it belonged to a different time. His calm demeanor didn't match the broken-down car or his weary expression. The contradictions unsettled her. When she closed her eyes, she could still see the way he had looked at her, his gaze filled with a depth she couldn't quite place. The gratitude in his voice felt far larger than her simple act of kindness. "You didn't have to do this," he had said, and yet she felt as if her small gesture had meant more to him than she understood. She replayed the moment in her mind, searching for clues, wondering if she'd missed something important. Sitting at the diner's counter during a lull, Emily found herself reflecting on the meaning of her actions. Was it enough? She wondered aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother's words came back to her then, spoken during one of their rare quiet evenings. Kindness isn't about the size of the gesture. It's about the heart behind it. Emily held on to those words as if they were a lifeline, though doubt still lingered in the corners of her mind. The encounter with the stranger had become more than just a fleeting memory. It wove itself into her life, a thread that seemed to connect to her own uncertainties. The unanswered questions he left behind mirrored her own struggles. What was his story? Why had he ended up at her diner on that stormy night? And why did she feel as if their paths had crossed for a reason? As Emily cleared a table, she glanced out the window at the rain starting to fall again. Something stirred inside her, a quiet sense that this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning. The week began with a grim discovery. Emily opened her refrigerator to find that it had stopped working overnight. The smell of spoiled milk hit her first, followed by the sight of wilted vegetables and ruined leftovers. Her heart sank. Every dollar spent on those groceries now felt wasted, and replacing them would strain her already tight budget. She pressed her forehead against the fridge door, fighting the urge to cry. "I can't keep up," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. The day took another turn when her landlord knocked on the door. He stood in the hallway, arms crossed, his tone firm but not unkind. "Emily, we need the rent by Friday. No exceptions this time." His words echoed in her mind long after he left, the weight of this ultimatum settling heavily on her shoulders. She glanced at the pile of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter and felt the walls of her small apartment closing in. Later that evening, Emily rushed home from her shift, hoping to find her mother in better spirits. Instead, she found her on the couch, pale and struggling to catch her breath. Panic surged through Emily as she knelt beside her. "Mom, do you need your inhaler? Should I call the doctor?" Her mother shook her head weakly, reassuring Emily that she just needed rest. But the sight of her so fragile was enough to break the dam of emotions Emily had been holding back. In the quiet of the night, she cried, her tears soaking into the fabric of the couch. Despite the mounting challenges, Emily found small moments to reflect on the depth of her responsibilities. Late at night, she sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, staring out the window at the city lights. Her thoughts drifted to the stranger she had helped in the rain. His gratitude felt like a distant but steady flame, warming her in moments of doubt. The next morning, her younger brother handed her a crumpled piece of paper covered in doodles. "This is for you," he said shyly. It was a drawing of their family, with her standing in the center, a smile on her face. "Thank you for everything you do for us," he added. Emily's eyes welled up as she hugged him tightly. That small gesture reminded her why she kept going, even when it felt impossible. Kindness seemed to ripple back into Emily's life when she least expected it. One evening, a regular customer at the diner left a tip far larger than usual. Alongside the folded bills was a note. "Thank you for your warm smile. It brightens my day." Emily tucked the note into her apron pocket, her heart a little lighter. Later that week, her coworker Jane approached her during a lull in the evening rush. "You look exhausted," Jane said, her voice filled with concern. "Let me cover your shift tomorrow. You need a break." Emily hesitated but eventually nodded, overwhelmed by Jane's thoughtfulness. The kindness of others reminded Emily that she wasn't alone, even in her struggles. These small acts, though fleeting, reignited her hope and strengthened her resolve. As Emily wiped down the counter at the end of a long shift, the bell above the door chimed. She looked up to see a man in a sharp suit, his presence out of place in the modest diner. He approached her with purpose, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tile floor. "Emily?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. She nodded, a mix of curiosity and apprehension swirling within her. "I'm here on behalf of someone you recently helped," he continued, handing her an envelope. "Inside, you'll find an invitation. I'll leave the details for you to read, but please know that your kindness hasn't gone unnoticed." Before she could respond, the man turned and left, leaving Emily staring at the envelope in her hands. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing a letter with an address scrawled in elegant handwriting. The location was unfamiliar, but the name at the bottom caught her attention: Robert Sterling. Emily spent the rest of the night debating whether to go. What could this stranger want with her? Why had he sent a lawyer? Her thoughts raced as she considered the risks and rewards. Ultimately, curiosity won. She decided to see for herself what lay beyond the ornate gates of the address listed. The morning of her visit, Emily reflected on how a single act of kindness had set this chain of events in motion. She thought of the support she received over the past week, from her brother, her coworker, and even the generous customer. It felt as though the universe was quietly rewarding her for her empathy. As she stood before the grand estate, its gates towering above her, she couldn't help but wonder how this moment would change her life. Adjusting her coat, she took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to face whatever awaited her. Emily stepped out of the borrowed car, her breath catching as her eyes scanned the sprawling estate before her. The driveway seemed endless, lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and towering trees that framed the grand mansion. She smoothed the wrinkles in her coat, a nervous habit, and took a deep breath. The contrast between her modest life and the opulence surrounding her was almost overwhelming. Her heart raced as she approached the massive wooden doors, her shoes clicking softly against the stone steps. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the ornate brass knocker. Before she could summon the courage to use it, the door creaked open. A tall, distinguished butler stood before her, his face kind but unreadable. "Miss Emily?" he asked, his voice smooth and reassuring. She nodded, clutching her purse tightly. "Mr. Sterling is expecting you," he said, stepping aside to let her in. The warmth of the mansion enveloped her instantly, a stark contrast to the chill of the autumn air outside. The interior was breathtaking: marble floors, a glittering chandelier, and walls adorned with paintings that seemed older than the house itself. Emily followed the butler down a long corridor, her footsteps echoing softly. At the end of the hall, she entered a cozy study bathed in the golden glow of a crackling fire. Sitting in a leather armchair was Robert Sterling, a man whose presence commanded the room despite his unassuming posture. His eyes, sharp yet kind, met hers, and he rose to greet her. "Emily," he said, extending a hand, "I'm so glad you could come." One evening, as Emily stopped by a small diner for dinner, she noticed a young waitress balancing a tray and a forced smile. The girl's exhaustion was evident, and Emily saw herself in the waitress's tired eyes. When the bill came, Emily left a generous tip alongside a note. "You are stronger than you think. Keep going." She watched from a distance as the waitress found the note, her shoulders shaking as she wiped away tears. The moment brought Emily back to her own journey, reminding her of the power of compassion. Months later, Emily stood in Robert's study, her fingers tracing the edge of an envelope he had left for her. The room felt emptier without him, the silence a stark contrast to his vibrant presence. He had passed away peacefully, leaving behind a legacy that touched countless lives. With trembling hands, Emily opened the envelope, finding a handwritten note inside. "Emily," it read, "you reminded me of the goodness in this world. Your kindness rekindled my faith in humanity. Carry it forward, and never doubt the difference you make." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she clutched the note to her heart. Robert's words became a guiding light, pushing her to honor his memory by continuing the work they had started together. Years later, Emily stood before a crowd at a community event, sharing her story. "I used to believe that my struggles defined me," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "But I've learned that our kindness can change not just our lives but the lives of those around us. Even the smallest actions matter." Her journey, from a struggling waitress to a beacon of hope, inspired those who listened. People approached her afterward, sharing their own stories and thanking her for reminding them of the power of compassion. Emily felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing she was making the ripple effect Robert had once spoken of. As she walked home that evening, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, Emily looked forward to the future. She had become a living testament to the transformative power of kindness, ready to continue creating ripples of change wherever she went. As Emily's story comes to a close, we invite you to pause for a moment and reflect on the power of kindness. Think about the small acts of compassion that have touched your life or the moments when your generosity created a ripple of change for someone else. We'd love to hear your stories. Share them in the comments below, whether it was a kind word, a helping hand, or a selfless act that made a difference. Let's inspire each other to spread kindness and keep creating ripples of hope in our world. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that remind us all of the goodness we're capable of.